The night the palace stopped breathing. The ballroom glittered as if the sky itself had shattered and rained stars onto polished marble. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen sunlight above the guests, each prism scattering gold across silk gowns, tailored suits, and the quiet arrogance of power. Outside, November winds clawed at the iron gates of the palace, but inside, warmth reigned, carefully curated, impeccably controlled. 200 guests filled the hall. And yet, not one of them was breathing properly anymore. Music faltered. A violinist's bow hovered midair. Conversation died in awkward fragments. Somewhere near the back of the room, a champagne flute slipped from nervous fingers and shattered against the floor, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. At the center of the ballroom stood a royal guard. His white-gloved hand was extended. Resting in his palm, caught inches from destruction, was a necklace worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. Diamonds glimmered under the lights. A deep blue sapphire sat at its center, ancient and regal, its surface reflecting generations of silent authority. 3 feet away stood Princess Anne, perfectly still. Across from her stood the queen consort, her composure strained, her lips pale, her neck suddenly bare. Time did not move. And in that suspended moment, one choice, made without permission, would fracture the illusion that the palace was untouchable. How did it come to this? Only an hour earlier, the evening had unfolded exactly as planned. Black cars lined the drive. Cameras flashed like lightning. Names were whispered before faces even appeared. Ambassadors, politicians, old money and new influence, gathered beneath one roof in an unspoken competition of relevance. It was a royal gala like dozens before it. And yet, from the moment the queen consort entered the ballroom, something shifted. Around her neck rested the necklace. Staff had referred to it reverently all afternoon. The sapphire legacy. 18 flawless diamonds framing a centerpiece stone the size of a robin's egg, cut generations ago by hands long turned to dust. It had once belonged to a queen who ruled through war. Before that, to another who ruled through grief. Before that, to a woman who believed the crown was not worn, but endured. Very few people knew the full history. Fewer still knew that Princess Anne had worn it once. 40 years ago. She had been barely 18 then, newly thrust into duty, terrified of making mistakes she would never be allowed to correct. That night, before her first state dinner, her mother had fastened the necklace around her neck with careful hands. "You belong here," she had whispered. "Never forget that." And never wore the necklace again. She told herself it was too heavy, too ceremonial, too symbolic. But watching it now, resting against another woman's collarbone, catching the light as laughter rippled around it, and felt something twist inside her chest. It wasn't jealousy. It was something older. Something that felt like being quietly erased from your own story. The guard who noticed everything. James Whitmore had been trained not to notice things like that. At least not outwardly. 28 years old. 6 years of service. Impeccable record. He stood near the ballroom entrance, posture perfect, eyes forward, every muscle disciplined into stillness. Royal guards were taught to see everything while appearing to see nothing at all. But James saw the way Princess Anne's jaw tightened. He noticed the way her fingers curled slightly into her palm, nails pressing into skin. He noticed the split second when her breath hitched, so subtle no one else caught it. Reading body language was part of his training. Understanding what wasn't being said was what kept people alive. What he didn't know was that within minutes, instinct would override protocol. And history would remember his name for it. A quiet confrontation. From a distance it looked harmless. 2 royals standing near the dessert table. Polite smiles. The illusion of civility. But James was close enough to hear the undertone. "That necklace," Princess Anne said calmly, though something in her voice vibrated beneath the words. "It was a gift to me." The queen consort smiled, unbothered. "It belongs to the crown. Not to any individual. It was given on a very specific night. And now," the queen consort replied smoothly, "it serves a different purpose." The words lingered like smoke. Anne's hand lifted, not to seize, not to accuse, but simply to touch. To remember. That was when it happened. A soft metallic click. A clasp, old, delicate, overworked by history, gave way. The necklace slipped free. 6 inches from disaster. Time slowed. 18 diamonds and 1 priceless sapphire tumbled through open air, spinning toward marble that would shatter both stone and meaning. James Whitmore did not think. He moved. Training took over. Muscle memory. Reflex honed through drills that assumed danger, not jewels. He lunged forward. Caught it. 6 inches from the floor. The room froze. A royal guard stood holding a symbol of centuries, his pulse roaring in his ears. Every eye locked onto him. Protocol flooded his mind instantly. Return the object to the nearest senior royal. That meant the queen consort. That was what everyone expected. That was what safety demanded. But something stopped him. He saw Princess Anne's face, not anger, not entitlement, but grief. He heard the tremor in her voice when she spoke of her mother. And in that impossible moment, James Whitmore made a choice. He turned. Anne extended the necklace toward Princess Anne. The sound of shock. The gasp that tore through the ballroom was physical. Camilla's face flushed crimson. And stood frozen, staring at the diamonds as if they might burn her. Security shifted. Whispers exploded. Diplomats exchanged looks that would be analyzed for weeks. James felt his career collapse in real time. "Your Royal Highness," he said quietly, voice steady despite his hammering heart. Before Anne could speak, footsteps thundered behind him. The head of palace security was already moving. And nothing in the palace would ever be the same again. The price of one human moment. The applause never came. That was what unsettled James Whitmore the most as uniformed hands closed around his arm and guided him away from the ballroom. There was no outrage shouted aloud, no dramatic scene for cameras. Just silence, thick, suffocating, deliberate. Silence was how the palace punished mistakes. The doors shut behind him, muting the orchestra's forced restart and the fragile laughter of guests trying to pretend nothing extraordinary had happened. The corridor beyond was narrow and dim, its stone walls absorbing sound as though secrets had soaked into them over centuries. Edmund Price didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. His grip tightened as they walked, fingers pressing into James's sleeve hard enough to bruise. Price had trained hundreds of guards over 3 decades. He knew how careers ended. This was how one began to die. Behind the curtains. They stopped in a small security office, functional, windowless, stripped of any luxury that reminded you where you were. A single desk. 2 chairs. A camera fixed high in one corner. Price finally released him and turned sharply. "What were you thinking?" he demanded. James stood at attention, pulse racing. "I reacted, sir." "You reacted?" Price's voice cracked. "You publicly contradicted protocol in front of foreign dignitaries, the Queen Consort and half the press corps of Europe." James swallowed. "The necklace was not your concern," Price snapped. "Your concern is order. Neutrality. Invisibility." James lowered his eyes. "I saw someone hurting," he said quietly. Price laughed, but there was no humor in it. "This palace runs on rules, Whitmore. Not feelings." He dropped into his chair, suddenly looking older than James had ever seen him. "They'll want your badge," Price said. "Tonight, if they can manage it quietly." James nodded. "I understand." "No," Price said sharply. "You don't. You'll never work security again. This will follow you everywhere. You had potential." James inhaled slowly. "I know." Price stared at him. "Then why?" James thought of his grandmother's hands, soft, arthritic, always busy. How she'd smiled even when life took things from her piece by piece. How no one had spoken when her brother claimed what wasn't rightfully his. "Because someone should have," James said simply. "The palace pretends." Back in the ballroom, the gala limped forward. The queen consort recovered swiftly, she always did. A comment about faulty clasps. A laugh. A graceful pivot toward the Italian ambassador. But the damage was done. Everyone had seen where the guard had turned first. Phones buzzed beneath tables. Messages were typed and erased and retyped again. Did you see that? Was that deliberate? Whose side was he on? By morning, headlines would speculate. By noon, narratives would harden. But for now, the palace smiled. Princess Anne was nowhere to be seen. A balcony and a memory. And stood alone on a stone balcony overlooking the gardens, the cold biting through silk. She welcomed it. The quiet pressed in around her. Real quiet, not the polished kind inside the ballroom. Her breath fogged the air as she stared at the dark hedges below. Her mother's voice echoed uninvited. "You belong here." Did she? A figure appeared behind her. Lady Sarah Peton, an old family friend, careful in her steps. "Quite a scene," Sarah said softly, and didn't turn. "That guard," Sarah continued. "They'll ruin him for this." Anne's fingers tightened on the railing. "I didn't ask him to do it." "No," Sarah said gently. "But he did it anyway." And exhaled shakily. "Why does it feel like that matters?" she whispered. Sarah stepped closer. "Because someone saw you as a person tonight, not a position." And closed her eyes. Midnight questions. James sat alone under harsh fluorescent light. His weapon was gone. His radio. Even his watch. 3 officials entered, faces neutral, voices precise. They asked him to recount the incident again. And again. And again. 17 times. Each retelling stripped his actions of humanity, turning them into bullet points and violations. "You created an international incident," one of them said coldly. "I didn't intend." "Intent is irrelevant." A paper slid across the table. His resignation. Sign quietly and disappear, or refuse and watch them dismantle his record piece by piece. James picked up the pen. His hand hovered. A knock interrupted the moment. Whispered words. Raised eyebrows. The atmosphere shifted. "Princess and request to speak with the guard," someone said reluctantly. The room fell silent. No one told Princess and no. The walk through history. James followed 2 escorts through empty corridors, footsteps echoing against stone older than consequence. The blue room awaited. And stood by the window, still in her gown, makeup smudged just enough to betray the truth. "They're firing you," she said without turning. "Yes, ma'am." "Because you tried to show kindness." James said nothing. She faced him at last. "Why did you do it?" He told her about his grandmother. About injustice dressed as legality. About silence. And listened without interrupting. "That necklace," she said softly, "was the night I learned I mattered." "You still do," James replied. Her eyes shone. A decision settled in her posture. "Come with me," she said. James hesitated. "Now," and added. And with that she walked toward a door no one challenged her at. The words she had never said. The blue room felt smaller than it ever had. Rich blue walls absorbed the lamplight, softening the sharp edges of history. Portraits of long-dead royals stared down from gilded frames, men and women frozen in authority, their expressions carefully neutral, as if none of them had ever doubted their place in the world. Princess Anne stood near the window, her back straight, her shoulders squared by habit rather than strength. James Whitmore remained near the door. He had been trained never to move unless instructed, never to speak unless spoken to, never to forget the distance between himself and royalty. Tonight had already erased those rules. "They're going to make this disappear," and said quietly, still facing the glass. "By morning there will be a statement. Polite words. Controlled regret. And you'll be gone." "Yes, Your Royal Highness." She turned sharply. "Stop saying it like that." James blinked. "Ma'am?" "Like I'm something fragile," she said. "Or distant. Say it like you did before." He hesitated. Then nodded. "Yes." And studied him. For the first time she wasn't looking at a guard. She was looking at a man who had risked everything without being asked. "Do you understand what you did?" she asked. "Yes." "And you'd do it again?" James didn't answer immediately. "I don't think I could live with myself if I didn't," he said at last. The words hung between them, simple, honest, devastating. And exhaled, a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. The weight of always being there. "You know," she said, turning away again, "people assume I don't feel things. That I'm solid. Reliable. Unmoved." James listened. "That's the role," she continued. "The dependable one. Not the heir. Not the symbol. Just the one who shows up." She pressed her fingers against the cold glass. "I have shown up my entire life." James shifted slightly, unsure if he was allowed to respond. "I stood beside my mother through grief," and said. "Through scandals, through wars of words and wars of silence. I learned early that feelings were inconvenient." She paused. "That necklace," she whispered, "was the one night I was told I belonged without earning it." Her voice trembled just barely. "And then I spent the rest of my life proving I deserved to stay." James felt something tighten in his chest. "I've watched you," he said carefully. "For 2 years. You never miss an event. Never complain. Never let anyone see when you're tired." And turned to him sharply. "People don't notice." "We do," James said. "The guards. The staff. The ones who don't get invited into history books." Her eyes glistened. "Do they?" she asked, softer now. "Yes." Silence filled the room, not the suffocating kind, but the kind that settles when truth has finally been allowed inside. A choice beyond protocol. "They'll say you embarrassed the palace," and said eventually. "I did," James replied calmly. "But I don't think dignity should require someone else's silence." And laughed quietly at that. "You really are going to ruin your life with sentences like that?" "Maybe," he said. But my grandmother used to say that being comfortable isn't the same as being right. And smiled sadly. She would have liked you. James lowered his gaze, unexpectedly moved. And straightened then. Something shifted in her posture. Not defensiveness, not anger, but resolve. They're handling this wrong, she said. Ma'am? They're treating this as damage control, and interrupted. But it's not damage. It's a symptom. James frowned slightly. Of what? Of a palace that has forgotten how to see people. She turned fully toward him. And I'm done pretending that doesn't hurt. Walking toward the unthinkable. And crossed the room, heels clicking softly against the floor. She stopped in front of James. You stood up for me when you didn't have to, she said. Now I'm going to stand up for you. James stiffened. You're royal? Anne, she corrected. Tonight. She moved past him and opened the door. Beyond it stretched a corridor lined with guards who froze in surprise as she emerged with purpose burning in her stride. Come with me, she said again. Where are we going? James asked. And didn't slow. To a conversation that should have happened years ago. The ornate double doors at the end of the corridor came into view. James recognized them instantly. The Queen Consort's private office. His heart slammed against his ribs. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't done. And didn't knock. She pushed the doors open. And stepped into history. The room where truth was no longer optional. The Queen Consort's office carried the weight of centuries. Not because of its size, it was modest by palace standards, but because of what it represented. Decisions made here never echoed loudly. They rippled. Slowly. Permanently. Bookshelves lined the walls, their spines worn smooth by hands long gone. Fresh flowers sat on a side table, their scent faint but deliberate. The desk, polished, heavy, immovable, had belonged to 3 consorts before her. Camilla looked up as the doors opened. Surprise flickered across her face. Then calculation. Anne, she said evenly. It's late. Yes, Anne replied, stepping fully inside. And we need to talk. James Whitmore remained just inside the doorway, every instinct screaming that he did not belong here. This was not his world. This was not his fight. And yet here he was. Camilla's gaze flicked to him. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This is highly inappropriate, she said, bringing a guard into a private discussion. He has a name, Anne replied. And he's about to lose his livelihood because he reminded me I'm human. Camilla exhaled slowly and rose from her chair. She crossed to the sideboard and poured herself a glass of water, her movements controlled, precise. You're being dramatic, she said, and laughed once, sharply. I've spent my entire life being undramatic. Forgive me if tonight I fail at it. The unspoken years. Camilla turned to face her. Do you think I don't understand what this looks like? She asked. A guard choosing sides? Offering a royal heirloom to someone other than the Queen Consort. James shifted uncomfortably but Anne raised a hand, silencing him. This isn't about sides, Anne said. It's about what that necklace meant, and what it no longer seems to. Camilla's expression hardened. It belongs to the crown. And I belong to what, exactly? And shot back. Duty? Silence? Being useful without ever being seen. The words landed harder than Anne intended. For a moment, Camilla said nothing. Then quietly she spoke. Do you think this has been easy for me? And blinked. I married into a family that already had its history, Camilla continued. I walk through rooms filled with memories that are not mine. I wear symbols heavy with meaning I had no hand in creating. She gestured subtly toward the desk, the walls. I didn't choose to replace anyone, Camilla said. I chose to serve. Anne's anger faltered, not gone but redirected. I never asked you not to exist, Anne said more softly. Camilla met her gaze. And yet I've never felt forgiven for doing so. Silence fell between them, thick but no longer hostile. The guard speaks. James cleared his throat. Both women turned toward him. If I may, he said carefully. Camilla raised an eyebrow. This ought to be good. James swallowed. I think you're both right, he said. And both wrong. That earned him a look from both sides. Princess Anne, he continued, choosing his words with care. You're hurt because that necklace represents the last time you were told you mattered without condition. Anne's breath caught. And ma'am, he said, turning to Camilla, you're angry because no matter how well you do your job, it never feels like enough. Camilla's grip tightened around her glass. You're both standing in the same place, James said quietly, looking at the same symbol, and seeing loss. The room felt suddenly smaller. I didn't offer the necklace to make a statement, James said. I offered it because I saw pain. And because sometimes protocol protects power, but not people. Camilla studied him for a long moment. You've already lost your career, she said. Why risk more by saying this? James straightened. Because silence is how people disappear, he replied. And closed her eyes. A decision is made. Camilla set the glass down carefully. You embarrassed me, she said to Anne. And your guard embarrassed the institution. And nodded. Yes. But, Camilla continued, you also reminded me why the institution exists. Both Anne and James looked at her. It exists to serve, Camilla said. Not to erase. She turned toward Anne. I didn't know what that necklace meant to you, she admitted. If I had. I know, Anne said quietly. And I should have said something before tonight. They stood there, two women bound by a history neither had written but both were expected to carry. Camilla looked back at James. They want you gone, she said. Cleanly. Quietly. James nodded. I understand. No, Camilla corrected. I don't think you do. She paused. There are ways to reframe a narrative, she said slowly. Ways to turn an incident into a lesson. Anne's eyes lifted. Camilla met her gaze. If we do this, Camilla said, it will be public. And didn't hesitate. Good, she said. I'm tired of quiet. James felt his knees weaken. The calm before the world finds out. Camilla returned to her desk and pressed a button. Cancel the resignation, she said to the aide who answered. Effective immediately. James froze. Ma'am, he whispered. Camilla looked at him steadily. You reminded us who we're meant to be, she said. That deserves protection. And stepped closer. And tomorrow, and added, we tell the truth. Camilla nodded once. Outside the office, the palace slept, unaware that something fundamental had just shifted. Inside, three people stood in the aftermath of honesty. And for the first time that night, James Whitmore believed that doing the right thing might not destroy him after all. The morning the palace spoke. The palace woke before dawn. Not with bells or ceremony, but with whispers. By 6 a.m., aides moved briskly through corridors with tablets clutched to their chests. Phones buzzed with headlines still being drafted, narratives still undecided. Outside the gates, journalists gathered earlier than usual, sensing that something had shifted overnight. Inside the palace walls, truth was finally being allowed to surface. The statement no one expected. James Whitmore stood alone in a small anteroom, hands clasped behind his back, uniform pressed but unfamiliar on his shoulders now. Sleep had barely touched him. Every possible future had paraded through his mind in the dark. Dismissal. Disgrace. Disappearance. Instead, a senior aide entered and handed him a printed statement. Read this, she said softly. James's eyes scanned the page. It wasn't a resignation. It was a declaration. A moment of humanity occurred last evening during a state function. The actions taken reflected the values we aim to uphold. Dignity, respect, and service. The individual involved acted with integrity. James looked up, stunned. You're not being disciplined, the aide said. You're being commended. His breath left him in a shaky exhale. A princess steps forward. At precisely 9 a.m., Princess Anne entered a press room she rarely used. There was no elaborate backdrop. No flourish. Just her, standing straight, composed, unmistakably present. Cameras flashed. She waited for silence. Last night, she began, a small moment revealed something important. She spoke of duty, of service, of how institutions can become so focused on order that they forget empathy. She spoke of a necklace, but more importantly, of what it symbolized. There are moments in life, she said, when someone chooses kindness without permission. That choice deserves recognition, not punishment. She paused. The guard involved acted with honor. No accusations. No blame. Just truth. And the world listened. The world reacts. By noon, the story had exploded, but not in the way palace strategists feared. Social media flooded with praise. Commentators called it a rare moment of honesty. Veterans spoke of duty beyond orders. Young people spoke of being seen. The narrative had shifted. The palace hadn't been embarrassed. It had been humanized. A quiet conversation. That evening, Princess Anne stood once more on the balcony overlooking the gardens. This time, James stood beside her, not as a guard on duty, but as a man allowed to breathe again. They'll forget the details, Anne said. They always do. James nodded. But they'll remember the feeling. She smiled faintly. You reminded me of something last night, she said. That being strong doesn't mean being invisible. James looked out over the darkening hedges. My grandmother used to say, he replied, that the bravest thing you can do is treat someone like they matter, especially when you don't have to. And turned to him. You mattered, she said. Before last night. And after it. James swallowed hard. The lesson the palace couldn't ignore. The necklace was returned to the vault that week. Not because it was unimportant, but because it was. Its story had been honored. Its meaning restored. James Whitmore remained in service, though his role changed. He became something rare inside those walls. A reminder. And Princess Anne? She continued doing what she had always done, showing up. But now, when she did so knowing that somewhere in the palace, someone saw her not as a symbol, but as a person. Final moral. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is not follow the rules perfectly, but remember why they exist. And sometimes, one quiet act of respect is louder than a crown.